Hello, welcome to the cheery topic of climate change and Doctor Who. I'm Kathryn Sullivan. I will be moderating this panel, and I'll have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Stacey.
Hi, my name is Stacey Smith. I'm a writer and editor of many books, including things like Who Was the Doctor, where I wrote under the name Robert Smith, but I've changed to Stacey. I'm the editor of Outside In. I've been a Doctor Who fan for a very, very, very long time. And I guess I've also been a climate change person for a very long time. I'm a scientist in my day job, and so I've done, mainly I studied diseases, but I've studied diseases in the context of climate change as well. So, that has no relevance to anything we could possibly imagine, does it?
And Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Zecca. I've been a fan of the show since '81. I want to talk more about my science credentials here. While I'm not working as a scientist at this point in my life, I'm on a third career as a public librarian. I started off in astrophysics, and then I transitioned into teaching at the high school level. And along that path, I spent 2 years working as a student assistant in the climate modeling section at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And I've had a few meteorology courses for teachers along the way. So I've got some scientific knowledge of what we're talking about. Also, in my astrophysics training, I had a certain amount of training on planetary atmospheres, did some modeling of snowfall on Mars, that sort of thing. So I'm not completely oblivious to the facts here, but I'm not like an expert either.
And again, I'm Kathryn Sullivan. I write fantasy and science fiction. I've got essays in Children of Time. I've got essays in Outside In. If you want my science background, I'm a retired university librarian who used to be the major liaison for our science department, our geology department, our nursing department. So I'm quite used to doing research. But in the meantime, Michael has let me give the description of the panel first. Last year's episode, Orphan 55, was a warning of the detrimental effects climate change could have on our planet, but it was not the first. References have been made in numerous episodes of humans who have ventured to the stars because Earth was no longer habitable. And Michael has volunteered to give the basic separation between weather and climate.
Right, and I could give you a boring textbook definition, but let's think about it this way. Weather is the stuff that's happening day to day in a particular location, and that can change a lot from day to day and year to year, although climate dictates a bit what is more typical at a particular time of year in a particular location. So for instance, the Southwest United States is typically a dry, hot place most of the year. You get monsoon rains typically at a certain time of year in India. And climate change can shift those patterns, those long-term patterns, those wider spread patterns. So for instance, the Sahara is very much a desert now, but at one point in history, it was more of a rainforest, and there has been a shift in climate there over thousands of years.
And typically, because the show has been on the air for so long, there has been a shift in the terminology. It used to be global warming. It used to be, you had the acid rain. You had all these various effects. Do we want to get into some of those differences, or do you want to?
I think we'll get into those as we progress. The thing I wanted to just kind of, and this will give us a framework to work with in this panel, is that there are basically three main categories of climate change that we're going to see in the course of Doctor Who, and really in general. And first of all, there's climate change through natural variations. Periods of extreme volcanism or solar variations or variations in the Earth's orbit do contribute to natural climate change, which led to things like the ice ages. There are also different types of artificial climate change, human-induced climate change. Some of it is an unintentional side effect, like the Industrial Revolution has created this global warming, global climate change. But there's also intentional artificial climate change, especially that we see in Doctor Who, but even some things that we have done, where there's an intent behind us changing it.
So like terraforming and stuff like that.
Exactly, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So we want to go episode in terms of the Doctor? Do you want to go by those various classifications?
Actually, I just want to start with two really notable Doctor Who monsters and their interaction with climate change. We'll start with the Daleks. So as we know, Skaro was ravaged by war between the Khalids and the Thals for many years, and it did become a nuclear war. And so there are those nuclear winter effects that Carl Sagan talked about. This would be an example of one of those unintentional side effects, climate changes. There's also the radiation, which isn't really affecting climate, but it's certainly affecting the biome. It's affecting the plant life, it's affecting the animals, and it led the Khalids to eventually go to their travel machines. So Davros's creation of the Daleks was in many ways a reaction to both the genetic mutations, but also to the change in climate on Skaro. It was a way for the Khalids to survive and adapt faster than doing it through traditional natural means. They might have headed there over the course of 50,000 years, but he pushed things along.
Yeah, I mean, he basically
accelerates
accelerates what's happening in order to get an idea, and that's how they realize, like, oh yeah, we're gonna have to do this anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And with the Cybermen, it's the same kind of thing. So Mondas was originally a twin planet of the Earth, sharing its orbit, but on the other side of the sun, which goes back in old 19th century theories about the solar system. But it was at some point ejected from the solar system. So this is a rogue planet without a sun. So it got very cold very fast. And so the Mondasians adapted by becoming Cybermen. So I don't know if I can say much more beyond that. They became, and they have spare. Someone in the chat said that Spare Parts really goes into that in detail. The Big Finish audio, which is essentially genesis of the Cybermen. Yeah.
So we want to go doctor by doctor? Do you want to jump into different types? Panelists, what would you like to do?
I think different types is fine. Yeah, I mean, on a very small scale, you have like the Green Death, right? So you see that sort of like, industrialization is changing things, and so it's and I think a lot of the Green Death is about change, right? And it's like it's the old jobs are disappearing, and like the miners are not doing they're doing what mining is available, but it's only from global chemicals now and stuff like that. And so you're seeing like the maggots get infused by the waste, and therefore they grow and so on. So you're seeing a change in the environment, and it's not the weather is changing, but it's you're seeing some more local change. So I think that's a good example of very small scale climate change in Doctor Who.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think mentioning the Green Death first also underlines something. As I was going through and jotting off episodes where I saw evidence of climate change, whether it was important to the plot or tangential, there's a lot of that in especially the Troughton and Jean Pertwee era. Mm-hmm. And I think it's part of a response to the culture, because environmentalism was becoming a huge thing in the 60s and into the 70s. And then it kind of falls off. And while there's bits of it across the rest of the 70s and 80s, it's not real big. And then we start to get some again in the new series. But it really, the strongest period of this in the show is in the Troughton and Pertwee eras. Yeah,
you have all this like weather control from the moon and stuff like that. So it's clearly a big thing.
Going to mention that. Yes. So the graviton in the moon base being used for weather control. They call it weather control. Really, in many ways, they're doing climate manipulation. And there's also quite a bit of that in The Enemy of the World.
Yes.
They're harnessing sun rays to generate crops, but then salamanders also using it to create droughts or floods,
volcanoes.
Or what have you. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
You control an entire subpopulation by that too.
Right. And so there, it's human induced, certainly artificial climate change, and it's very intentional. Whereas, like in the Ice Warriors, that one happens to just be set during a future ice age. We've started to have a shift from our natural variations, and which, granted, human industrialization has probably pushed us away from. We probably would be starting to flow. And I'm not saying that we'd have an ice age in 50 years, but I'm just saying that just through natural variations, we probably would eventually be heading back to another ice age. But 200 years of industrialization has really warmed the climate and held that back.
And do you want to go into thin ice?
I'd like to come back to that one later, because actually there was another one that I had on my mind, which was The End of the World, which was Rose's second story. So very far in our future, the sun will eventually expand to a red giant phase. It'll be running out of hydrogen to fuse and starting to do helium, fusing with lithium and things like that. And there is, in a star, there is a delicate balance between the amount of energy it's producing from the fusion, which is pushing the star out, and gravity pulling it back together. And as you start to get to those less efficient fuels as a star ages, it's taking more energy to create the energy that's being made, so it's less efficient, and gravity is struggling, and eventually the star does start to expand and cool, which is why it goes red and why it goes large. And in the end of the world, they describe that the Earth actually should have experienced the sun expanding to red giant phase sometime before the end of the world, but they have actually been using technology to hold back the sun's expansion. And the party there in the end of the world is they're getting ready to actually turn that technology off and let the natural thing happen and let the sun expand. And so at this point in Earth's life, they've evacuated all the important life off the planet by this point, because when the sun expands, it will wipe out life on Earth.
They've also the continents back too. Like they've done a lot of manipulation.
Yes.
Yes, it's restored the classic Earth. Actually, I want to come back to the ice warriors and the Ice Age, because there's a fear that with the melting polar ice caps, one of the things that keeps Europe like less cold than it otherwise would be is the fact that it's the Arctic Sea is quite salty, right? And so that's actually stops a lot of the snow. So even though London is way further north than Canada, it's a lot less snowy there. This is one of the reasons. So the fear is, though, if you dilute the salt off the coast of Europe, then the warming of the planet can actually plunge Europe into a new ice age. So it's quite possible. It's not the method they posit in the Ice Warriors, but it is certainly something that both is theoretically possible, and then they check the fossil records, and this has happened before.
Oh yeah, and the when people think about climate, they only tend to think about the air, the atmosphere. There are certain regular patterns like the jet streams and the doldrums that sort of keep some permanent high pressure in places like the poles, and permanent low pressure certain other places, which creates dry areas like the Sahara and wet areas like the Brazilian rainforest. And those can shift over time because of the kind of things you're talking about. But there's another component in that there are patterns in the ocean currents that also affect the atmosphere. A notable one, besides the northern Atlantic you were talking about, is out in the southern Pacific, is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. We switch between El Nino and La Nina, and that has a great effect on weather all over the globe. It changes the winters in Minnesota. The people that live in South America are very aware of it because it very much affects the climate there.
Australia too.
Yeah. So anything that changes sea levels, it dumps more fresh water into the ocean, changes the salinization, it changes those currents. Back when I was working at NCAR, we were trying to develop a better community climate model for people to use in their global warming studies. We were working with Community Climate Model 2, CCM2. We were developing CCM3. It kind of finished up about 6 months after I left. And what was unique about CCM3 was that for the first time, there was a dynamic oceanographic model and a dynamic atmospheric model interacting with each other. Prior to that, in climate studies, the atmosphere people would use a fixed ocean model, and the ocean people would use a fixed atmospheric model. And this is the first time that they were interacting with each other. The oceanographic model was rudimentary, but we're a couple generations beyond that now because the computer technology has gotten so much better. And now they are very much interacting with each other in the models, so we do a better job of measuring the effects when we change the climate.
We can also get into some of the episodes where it was only mentioned a little bit that the people had to leave Earth, like Sunmakers, Frontier.
The Ark.
The Ark.
The Ark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Ark was one that stuck out for me. It's set 10 million years or more in the future, and expansion of the sun has already started a little bit and is starting to cause problems for life on Earth. And even the Ark in Space trilogy, the Nerva Station trilogy, we're 10,000 years in the future, and we're in a period of increased solar activity. There are more large solar flares, and there's evidence of this in the geologic record having happened before, and this does affect life on Earth. You know, a strong solar flare will really mess up the Van Allen belts and mess up our protection from the solar radiation that starts to affect plant life and other life on the planet. And so the Earth was evacuated there. And as we saw, as they went down on the Sontaran experiment, plant life is growing back pretty well at this point in history because we're past the solar flare period. The Earth's had some time to recover. But we've gone through this at many times in history as well. And actually,
I think
we're very much in a solar minimum right now.
Pardon,
Sorry,
Stacey?
say that again?
Oh, sorry, I just said, you know, the Earth recovers pretty well in the Sontaran experiment, but I think in part because there's no humans for a long time. And so take us out, and you know, yeah.
Right. And so this can take us back into that thin ice discussion. So the last 20 years or so, we've really had a fairly quiet sun. It started to wake up again in the last year or so, but there have really been a real dearth of sunspots and solar flares, coronal mass ejections. There have been a few notable ones, but the sun has been relatively quiet for the last 20 years. And that's unusual. That actually usually leads to periods of cooling, not heating. And yet we've had some of the warmest 20 years on record because of human intervention in the climate. But there are other periods in history where, even in recorded history, where the sun has gone through long minimums like this. And the most notable one was from about 1650 to 1715, which is known as the Grand Solar Minimum. But even over the period from about 1303 to 1860, we were very much in a quieter sun period that led to a lot more cold in the northern hemisphere. There were some desalinization effects, I think, involved as well. But this is known as the Little Ice Age. And if you think about how dreary the Middle Ages usually seem to us in terms of rain and cold, whenever we see that in movies, that is legit. That was actually going on. If you remember George Washington in that horrible winter at Valley Forge, it is part of this. The winters were colder then because of some natural variations. Europe ran colder and wetter during that time, and we see that in thin ice. And there's an additional thing going on. So if thin ice is set in 1814, the haunting of Villa Diodati is set in 1816. There were a lot of major volcanic eruptions over that time period, 1808, 1812, 1813, 1814, with finally Mount Tambora erupting in April 1815, which is one of the largest, volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The Mount Tambora eruption alone cooled the global climate by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And you're saying, well, that's not a big deal, it's a degree. We're talking globally over the course of the whole year, on average, you're 1 degree colder worldwide. What that means is in some places it's warmer and in some places it's a lot colder. And we've been seeing that through just a man-made climate change in recent years with the incredibly hot summers in Australia that created those horrible brush fires there last year. And the really deeply cold winters we get sometimes, the way Alaska is warming during the winter, we're seeing a lot of variation, but for this particular time period in history, it was pretty cold. And in 1816 specifically, Europe basically did not have a summer. It was maybe spring and autumn at best. There were also effects in China. There were floods and famine and late monsoons in India that led to a cholera outbreak. And so that, dreary, cold, rainy day where Mary Shelley and the rest are trapped in that house coming up with the story of Frankenstein that we kind of see in a different way in The Haunting of Villa Diodati is totally legit, was actually happening due to this natural variation caused by extreme volcanism over a short period. And thin ice is also an example that the Thames used to freeze over during the winter, and they could have these frost fairs and things, and that doesn't really happen much anymore. Even the Delaware River, when we talked about George Washington Valley Forge, there's that famous photo of George Washington crossing the Delaware. The Delaware at that point is fairly thin and freezes over in the winter sometimes, but it doesn't much anymore. It certainly did at that time.
Stacey, any you want to bring up?
Yeah, I guess I like your point that it kind of goes quiet for a couple of decades in Doctor Who, and then I mean I certainly remember being quite aware of climate change in the late 80s, early 90s, and suddenly it's coming back. But I don't think we really see it on Doctor Who do we see it in the late classic series a little bit, maybe? But just in pieces. I guess I mean,
jotted down a few places. So and sometimes it comes in very interesting and odd ways. So for instance, the Sunmakers, they've made Pluto habitable by creating artificial suns to create heat and light. Meglos, I think, touches on climate change on Zolfathura. Meglos is the last of the Zolfathurans. He's a cactus, and it's a desert world, but he's the last plant life on that planet. So presumably it's been a desert for a while, but not this much of a desert. We don't know why Zolfathura has changed, but it has clearly become hotter and drier. Earth shock is another example, I think. You go, wait, Earth shock? What? The Cretaceous tertiary extinction was caused by an asteroid, as we have plenty of evidence now. But the Doctor Who version of that is it wasn't an asteroid, it was the freighter that Adric was on. So Adric killed the dinosaurs and created climate change that led to us.
Thank you, Adric.
Yes. And another example I see is the Mysterious Planet, the first story in the Trial of the Time Lord, in that the Earth was dragged across space to a new location by the Time Lord, somewhere in the Andromeda Galaxy or something. Those tidal forces alone, just from the move, did something to devastate civilization. And what's left of humanity at this point is definitely living in a more primitive state. And so the climate has returned more to that pristine pre-industrial state, kind of like happened in the Planet of the Apes movies once the humans were put aside.
Actually, I guess there's a bit of it in Curse of Fenric too, right? With the the Hemovore's world is basically one that is basically
it's another future Earth, and that's something that bothers me a little bit actually. So like the Nerva beacon stuff, we know about solar flares and humanity leaving and going out exploring the Earth Empire and whatever, and yet some point in the future we end up with the Morlocks of Orphan 55, and I'm sorry, I'm going to call them Morlocks because that's essentially what they are. Or the Hemovores at some point far in the Earth's future as well, that we're going to somehow become that.
Well, I think even in Colony in Space, Earth is a slag heap, and so
I was going to say there's definitely some continuity there in the Pertwee era between different stories set in that future. Colony in Space, Frontier in Space, and the Mutants are all set in an Earth Empire around the year 3000. With some variation in years and all. And it was mentioned clearly in the Mutants that by that point that industrialization had so polluted the air on Earth, it was becoming uninhabitable by humans, which is why they were out colonizing, all these different planets and trying to terraform them. And that's exactly what they were doing to Solos, was trying to terraform Solos to make it more inhabitable by humans.
And Frontiers. Invasion of the dinosaurs may be because they were hoping to escape the pollution of Earth.
Yeah, they were kind of
basically the propaganda.
Yeah, they were responding to industrialization, but using time travel as the trick to try to make the Earth a bit more Cretaceous than the current epoch. Yep.
Yeah, well, even I guess the Silurians, it's not so. I mean, they try and alter the Van Allen belt and stuff like that, make the Earth different. And I think even there's things like Terror of the Zygons when they're going to change the planet. The
Zygons were terraforming, absolutely. Yeah. There's a few examples. Even another one that kind of fits in is the Sontaran stratagem and the Poison Sky. Sontarans are poisoning the atmosphere, which changes the chemical nature of the atmosphere. And the intent is to kill off the humans, but it would actually enact some climate change because of the different chemicals in the atmosphere. We know that if we add a lot of sulfur someplace, that's going to create effects globally. Yeah. Just the factories in Germany create effects in other places. A lot of the air pollution that Denver was experienced in the 80s, I think, did not even come from Los Angeles, but from China.
And we basically get the winds blowing the Sahara sand across the Atlantic to South America for the soil produced that they need in Brazil over the Amazon. I'm not saying it clearly, but weather patterns across the globe.
Now, to get away from like the artificial climate change and back to the natural for a moment, I did want to highlight two stories again. One of this is coming back to the mutants, and the other would be Full Circle, because both of these stories involve a long-term evolutionary adaptation by the main species in the story, the Solonians and the mutants and the Alzarians in Full Circle, in response to a, two orbital differences. The Solos has a 2,000-year orbit around its sun, and yet is inhabitable. That must be a really hot blue giant or something that has somehow managed to last long enough to have life arrive, because I don't know how else would work otherwise. It's a 2,000-year orbit, so they have 500-year seasons, and they're basically in the process of moving from spring to summer, which causes the mutations in the Solonians where they go from the human phase to the insectoid phase, and then are drawn to the radioactive caverns to eventually go into their godlike energy being phase. And the terraforming that's happening is accelerating the cycle, and it's happening over a much quicker time and causing more problems. And
kind of a question.
Circle, we have the spiders and the marshmen and so forth in that same cycle.
Yeah.
And that whole idea of why are the marshmen looking humanoid? It's because you had that colony ship crash land on that planet, and they started bombing after that.
Right. Right. Yeah, and and of course in Full Circle they've kind of hidden the truth of their evolutionary cycle, and it's maintained in the ship's records very deep, and it's been sort of the the hidden secret of the family. They're not humans, but they're native Alzarians that are maintaining this human ship. So yeah, cool.
We had somebody else ask earlier about Gallifrey. But of course, we don't know the whole cycle of how long Gallifrey has been changing. That we've only had the city dwellers, and we've got one tribe of people out in the wasteland.
Well, Gallifrey is such an advanced civilization. They had to have,
I mean, they have their giant dome and everything to live in. Originally, I suppose maybe they needed that because it was, not as habitable as it could be or something. But yeah, we don't get the history really of the changing planet in there.
I think Inferno is an interesting one to discuss as well, because again, it talks about the effects of the runaway volcanism and the effect that has on climate.
And releasing something from below the Earth.
Right. But a lot of what you're releasing that's causing the problem is sulfur and carbon dioxide. There have been periods in our history where the volcanism across the globe has been far stronger than anything we've seen. I mean, of course, you hear the stories about Yellowstone being a giant volcano, mega volcano that's going to go off someday. But we've had periods like this that have caused mass extinctions. At the end of the Devonian, there was a lot of volcanism that led to mass extinction there. And the Permian Triassic extinction event also is another one where the Siberian traps, which is a good chunk of Siberia was volcanoes. And more than 720,000 cubic miles of lava were released across Siberia, which released more than 14.5 trillion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. That's a lot more than humans have done in recent years. And the climate change was immense, and most of life on Earth was wiped out, and then it came back. So Stallman wasn't intending to do this necessarily, but as we saw in the alternate universe, that we ended up basically releasing a mega volcano there ultimately and really messing things up.
Yeah, I love the comment just in the chat about Edric, when he exploded in the freighter, he spread his DNA all over the Earth. So we're all descended from Edric. That's why we look like the way we do.
I thought we were descended from phone sanitizers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also have a reference to London riding through space on the back of Space Whale.
Well, I guess that's all part of that sort of that arc of the arc, right? It's like everyone fleeing the Earth as the Earth is dying, and they flee in different ways, and so one of those is a space whale. So
Another one I noted here was the underwater menace. Professor Zeroff had a plan to drain the ocean supply, but I mean, besides the obvious, food issues and water issues, it would mess up all those mechanisms in the ocean currents that would ultimately affect climate worldwide.
Mhm.
And what's he going to do with his octopus? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Seeds of Death is another one. The ice warriors are basically trying
Yes.
to terraform Earth, but using a fungus, of all things, to wipe out some of the native species and alter the atmosphere. So yeah, again, where the ice warriors are involved in terraforming, the Zygons have tried to terraform the Earth.
Mhm.
So it's not always about Earth trying to terraform other planets like we often get in other sci-fi things. We often have the aliens trying to make it more habitable for them here.
Yeah.
Which is a storyline that runs through some Twilight Zone episodes, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
covered a lot of the ones I had been. New Earth. I did New Earth have, but that was another planet entirely. But why did they leave Earth? They've been
Well,
destroyed.
this is a sequel to End of the World.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
the sun has gone to red giant phase. Earth has not been habitable for a while, but the Earth Empire has expanded so far that it's out into other galaxies. Earth is a galactic level empire at this point in history, which is a big deal in sci-fi. In the year 3000, where Frontier in Space and so forth, it's an interstellar empire. It's more like your Federation and Star Trek. We're talking a galactic level empire where it's covering multiple galaxies. This is the sort of thing that is in the high concept sci-fi novels, and it's the sort of thing the Daleks maybe achieved at their best points. When, like in the Dalek Master Plan, when they're fiddling about with multiple galaxies and so forth.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
and again, it's because it's 5 billion years in the future. You're talking, there's been a lot of genetic evolutionary change as well as artificial manipulation. So you've got, apple grass,
Mhm.
And space cats.
Yeah, space cats and all of that.
I mean, one example that's not really obvious one, I think, is maybe like the fires of Pompeii, right? You do have a massive climate change thing happening. You have a lot of people denying that it's going to happen. You kind of, like, I don't think it's a climate change story per se, but it's got a lot of the hallmarks of it.
Although it is another terraforming story. The pyrophiles are
right.
trying to make the Earth more hospitable to them because they like that extreme heat. They function better down in our volcanoes, so if they can heat the Earth up through more volcanism, it will help them live here. Yeah, and their world is gone because of Davros mucking about with things. But as we would find out later on, so yeah, it's another terraforming.
I mean, I guess
story.
if you kidnap planets, that is climate change in some way.
Yeah.
And Vampires of Venice, weren't they going to try to terraform the slow way?
I've forgotten that story so much.
Because I think they had a plan.
I mean, they were another planet that had been lost, and so
So it gets a little convoluted there.
Yeah, were they going to poison the water or something? And I don't remember.
No, it wouldn't poison the water because they live in it, but they were going to spread that water out a lot more.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I would be remiss not to mention my two least favorite Capaldi stories in this because of their horrible science. Yet there's climate change involved there. First one would be Kill the Moon, which I've spent a lot of time ranting about at other panels at Console Room in the past. Yeah. It's got some of the worst science in the history of Doctor Who and written during an era where they could fact check things online in 5 minutes. But all those title changes, if the moon's gravity really was changing, if its mass really was changing, which makes absolutely zero sense, then that would affect tides on the Earth, which would affect those ocean currents. And it would also stir up some of the volcanoes, which would add some sulfur and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And boom, you've got climate change.
And I'll bet you I know the other one, In the Forest of the Night.
In the Forest of the Night, yes, exactly. Where again, the Earth is under threat from solar flares or a large coronal mass ejection or something. And this one's big enough, it's going to burn off the ozone layer and cause problems for humanity. And fortunately, we have magic fireproof trees to save everyone. Okay, throughout the magic fireproof trees, at least they were on the right track with the effect that a large enough solar flare could have.
Yeah.
I mean, even in our lifetimes, in 1986, there was a solar flare or coronal mass ejection that was large enough and impacted the Earth directly enough. When it hit the Van Allen belts, which are the magnetic, fields protecting the Earth, it brought enough stuff down into northern Quebec. It actually knocked out the power grid over a portion of Quebec for weeks, if I recall. It was like you set off an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. It was talk about, when you're talking about nuclear weapons and the like, and just took out a good chunk of the electronic infrastructure there. With as reliant as we are on computers now compared to back then, this would be devastating to civilization if this happened now.
Like a Y2K. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then some. Oh yeah. So certainly,
Plus side, you do get these beautiful auroras, but
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and when Elon Musk talks about terraforming Mars, one of the biggest concerns about humans living on Mars is the solar radiation. We have an ozone layer that protects us from some of the ultraviolet light, but we also have this magnetic bottle around us because of the strength of the Earth's magnetic field that deflects the majority of the radioactive particles and things coming off the sun, so they don't come in and fiddle with our DNA. The magnetic field of Mars is pretty weak, and those Van Allen belts at Mars are basically right in the surface of the planet, not 100 miles up or 1,000 miles out. They're literally right in the surface of the planet. It is not giving a protective layer. And so there is a concern that cancers and things would be a very common problem. And even mutations in offspring would be a huge problem, and so on. And that does raise questions then about how things work for the ice warriors when they lived there. They have to have been pretty hardy to have survived these conditions. Maybe Mars's magnetic field was stronger in the past, and changes in weakening of the magnetic field as the core of Mars cooled is what made things inhospitable for the Martians.
But that explains our armor.
To some extent.
It might do. Yeah. Well, I think you've also got the waters of Mars too, right? And so the waters of Mars, you basically you're releasing something that's inside that was quite happily there, and then
there's some pathogen that may have led to them leaving as well. But it does raise questions about this. Jupiter has an incredibly strong magnetic field. Earth's a very strong magnetic field for the size of the object it is. Mars is pretty weak, and the moon as well. The moon basically has nothing, and so you again would need to have some sort of protection. And this is why they look at, for instance, living underground.
Both Moon and Mars. Yeah.
Yep. And Ceres and the Expanse.
Now, has anybody really kind of the trouble I have with Orphan 55? We don't exhale oxygen. Why is our supposed descendants suddenly doing that?
Well, I think what they're trying to suggest there is we have so polluted the atmosphere by that point with carbon dioxide that we're having to change our transpiration cycle to something more like what trees do, which is to breathe in the carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. That's what happens during photosynthesis, essentially. So, you're taking carbon dioxide and combining it with other things to make food, and oxygen as a side effect. In human STP cycles and such, it's the opposite. You're bringing in the oxygen and you're exporting carbon dioxide.
Well, that's why I was kind of looking at that and saying, well, I don't think those are future humans.
Yeah, it would be difficult to go from one to the other without some genetic manipulation, I would think. It wouldn't just happen naturally very easily.
Yeah, with enough evolution, you could get there, but it's...
Yeah, but it would be a weird period in between where you'd be doing both.
Yeah.
Being counterintuitive, but I could see what genetic manipulation. And so, you could have had a Davros-like scientist that, manipulated the human genome in order to be able to survive, and that's why they became this way. But yeah, there's a lot about Orphan 55 that doesn't make sense that way. Like I said, also in light of what we already know about the Earth Empire in the year 3000, about the Earth, 100,000 years from now, and so on from other stories, it doesn't quite add up why we ended up as Morlocks for a while. Although maybe they were the lower class people that couldn't afford to get off planet in 3000.
But they can afford to be genetically mutilated.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that, like, you know, not everyone on Earth is the same, and so therefore it's quite possible you could have this coexistence happening. That you could have some creatures, you know, because they're, you know, in some part of the world that's being affected much more than others, and you know, all the different stuff that can go on. Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of the climate change stuff in my day job is around, like, you know, how does it have an effect on disease? And so that's why I was interested in, like, you know, the waters of Mars with a pathogen being released and so on, because this does happen quite a bit, right? And so, you know, things like, you know, the warmer it gets, the faster mosquitoes breed, and therefore you get more malaria transmission and so on.
Exactly.
And you know, even if you have like shock events that happen, you know, there's like earthquakes and so on, like, you know, can release pathogens. This happens in China and stuff like that. So, you know, there's I think quite a potential for storytelling in Doctor Who for this that hasn't really been exploited much, that I think is possible.
Even in our current pandemic, we've obviously seen how the spread has been greatly enhanced by being in winter and being indoors. You know, being inside more in a dry climate with circulating air systems that can move the virus around and get it to you is worse than when we were outdoors during the summer months, where it was harder to spread it around and when there was more moisture in the air. These are, you know, known effects with virus. This is why we have cold and flu season.
Yeah, I mean, deforestation is like, you know, is what leads to it in the first place, right? And like, you know, you're interacting with animals much more because they don't have any place to go, and like that's where diseases jump species a lot. That's mostly how we get new diseases.
But also a climactic shift to a, you know, colder, drier climate would work against us with some of these things because we'd be indoors more. But then the climate shift to a warmer, more humid climate, like you said, causes problems with things like malaria. So,
It's also been interesting to notice how the Earth is kind of recovering from us since all the humans have been trapped inside for so many months.
You know, I was hoping that would be the case, but just in the last few days, I read that 2020 was the second warmest year on record since we started keeping records back in the 19th century.
Well, it probably would have been the warmest.
It would exactly. That's probably the silver lining, is it would have been the warmest by far, but we didn't do a great job last year, even with that.
But
I think that goes to show it's not just individuals who can make the difference, right? It's like, you know, yes, we all stayed home and that made a bit of difference, but it's not really about like, you know, like I just gotta, like, you know, drive less. It's really about, we need deep structural changes for this.
Absolutely. Because even though we were home more, we weren't driving, we were using more electricity in our homes rather than in our workplaces. And there was still a pressure on the electrical grid from that. And, you know,
I mean, most pollution is corporate anyway, and so, you know, military and stuff like that. So
Scrolling back to see if there's some stories I noted that we didn't discuss yet. Well, I mean, I think we can go back to the Silurians and the Sea Devils a little bit too, just in terms of why they were in cold storage underground. You know, okay, the whole thing about the moon arriving and causing tidal changes in the Holocene or whatever Eocene, okay, that's a little crazy. The moon formed far beyond that, but early 70s, okay, we didn't really understand the moon as well yet. But the idea was that so the arrival of a large satellite would have caused enough tidal forces to get the volcanoes going to cause climate change on Earth. And the Silurians and the Sea Devils' answer to that was, we're just going to go into hiding and ride this out rather than go through this extinction event. We're going to hide and wait till it's over and the ecosystem is recovered, and we'll pop out and things will be just hunky-dory. And of course, their alarm clock didn't work and the humans cropped up in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of them left, as you saw in Dinosaurs in a Spaceship too, and like, you know. Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think also what's interesting is this kind of like, you know, preservation idea, right? So like, you know, we're going to leave the Earth, you know, whoever's leaving, and, you know, we'll build arks where we can preserve what we have, or we bring dinosaurs with us to preserve what there was. And because I think like a lot of climate change means things get lost, and so it's, you know, there's a lot of effort put into like, you know, remembering what there was, even if it's going to disappear.
A lot more of the genetic banks.
Yeah, that's right. With potential an eye to recreating it. I mean, even in the Ark, you see that too, right? And like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so there was a comment in the chat a while ago I was just looking for, asking about the air zone solution. So air zone solution is not official
yes.
Doctor Who, but it essentially is Doctor Who. It's one of those Bill Baggs productions that was done at the 30th anniversary that featured John Pertwee, Colin Baker, Peter Davison, Sylvester McCoy. It was supposed to have Sophie Aldred as the villain, but she wasn't available. Alan Cumming was in this before he was really well known. And in some ways it's like a multi-doctor story, but they're humans. But the premise here where it fits into this panel is that it's set in the near future where climate change has gotten worse. The air has become less breathable. It's, as we've seen in places like Hong Kong and Seoul and Japan, where it's been very common for people the last 10, 15 years to go out in public wearing a mask, even before the SARS pandemic, just because of the air quality, that it's become much more common to wear a breather mask outside to protect you from asthma and stuff from this polluted air in Britain. So air zone solution definitely.
I mean, that was happening in Australia a year ago with all the fires and the smoke and stuff like that.
Exactly. In Colorado as well. My parents had multiple forest fires within a few miles of them, and it was awful. And it actually wasn't even great here in the Twin Cities the last 2 weeks. The air quality was horrible. And so that more frequently happening to the point where it's part of the daily weather forecast. Don't forget to wear your mask today. The pollution index is really high today, and so on. And so they were definitely.
And this was made in the early '90s, right? So this is quite predicting what's going to happen. Yeah, and so so the idea is that they built in like breathable gills or whatever, essentially, for people.
That was the air zone solution. Air zone's thing was, rather than come up with a clean in the atmosphere, we're going to modify humans to have gills to filter this stuff. Yeah.
Which is the same time as thinking that comes up with the drags and Orphan 55. Okay.
So in many ways,
it's step one in this evolution, right?
Exactly. So it really does feel like a Doctor Who story on climate change, even though it's technically a side product.
Yes, if you can ignore Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant making out.
Yes. Although, how perfect was it to have Sylvester McCoy as an environmental activist?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. So, cool. All right.
Any other episodes you'd like to bring up? I've already covered most of the ones on my list.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, we mentioned earlier, End of the World. There's a line in there about Cassandra grew up in the Arctic desert.
Yes.
It's a throwaway line, but you're like, oh, right, if the Arctic is now a desert, like, some serious climate change has happened by this point.
Well, and we saw the Beauchene Peninsula with Jack on Torchwood, too, when he was young. The climate in Finland is definitely different in the 51st century than it is now. I think we got hints of that in even in Talons of Wang Chiang when talking about the future. Weren't they talking about something to do with ice ages or something? I mean, so there's hints of how in 3,000 years, 30,000, 4,800 years, things are going to be a bit. No, 3,000. I don't know. There's hints that it's going to be. It's Sunday, my brain shut, but it's going to be different in the future. That there will be these natural climatic changes as well as the artificially enhanced things. So.
Are there anything in the chat?
Larry was saying in the chat, aren't there already Arctic climates already considered to be desert just because the definition of desert isn't tied to temperature but more towards precipitation and rainfall? Absolutely correct. A desert is a dry place. It doesn't have to be hot or cold. The Arctic is fairly desert. Mars is very much a desert in that sense. It is a very dry place. Mars may have had liquid water on the surface at some time in its past. There's still some debate on that, whether it was fully liquid water or more of a brine or what have you, but it's definitely a desert now and drier than anything on the Earth is. And Antarctica was very lush at one time. Yeah, Antarctica has been a desert, while it's been trapped under these ice caps, but it was a very lush place at some points in history. It also wasn't always at the South Pole. With tectonic shifting, Antarctica was at times more like Australia and the like, up a little bit further. And there are definitely dinosaur remains there and stuff that'd be interesting to find once we get under the ice. So, yeah.
So we're coming up to at least 12 minutes, so depending on when we're actually stopping, because I haven't gotten the signal yet. So any other thoughts of episodes? Or any?
I was going to say that I think that whether they focus on climate change or not in the show is sometimes depends on who the showrunner is at the time. Obviously, Barry Letts had this stuff more in mind, and many of the writers on his team, like Malcolm Hulke, were very steeped in social issues and environmental issues. And, you know, maybe that wasn't that important to Russell T Davies when he brought the show back. He was focused more on the characterizations and the character moments and so forth. Some producers have been more activist in working social issues into the show than others, or science issues into the show than others.
I mean, I think Doctor Who is well poised to talk about this stuff because you can have a broader view. I mean, I think one of the problems with climate change is, like, you know, even if it's happening fast, it's still happening on a scale that it's hard to observe kind of, you know, for the regular person. Whereas Doctor Who, you can, you know, step back and you can jump through time and you can observe planets going through stuff. So I would be absolutely certain there's going to be more climate change stories to come in the future, and we could do potentially like very grand things with, you know, the TARDIS and stuff like that, rather than just having them as sort of monsters that pop up as a punchline. And you know,
and I think sometimes it's done well when it's just subtle and in the background too. You know, the Seeds of Death is taking, was it Seeds of Death? The Ice Warriors original one was you know, just taking place in a time period that happened to have some climate change, but it wasn't the main focus of the story. It just was a thing. Whereas Orphan 55 was beating us over the head with humans are responsible for this. You know,
my view on these things is like the time when you don't beat people over the head is when you have solved the problem, right? So it's like if we completely solved climate change, then yeah, that would be too on the nose. But it's like, you know, I think the problem is people look at Ice Warriors and they don't inherently think, oh yeah, climate change, we should do something about that. Right. And I think sometimes you do need a hammer.
But I think it can also be done in subtle ways that get the point across without being obnoxious about it. And I think The Expanse television series has done that extremely well. Right in the opening credits, you see building happening over a couple of centuries to the Earth as the Earth is, you know, civilization is progressing. And you see seawalls go up along the border of New York City and around the Statue of Liberty because sea level is rising. And it's not in your face, it's just there. You know, and then there's an episode in one of the seasons where one of the characters is down trying to get a look at the ocean, has to kind of go work around these seawalls in New York City because she was in the UN building prior to this. And it's just part of the infrastructure of the show without being in your face about it. It's not the primary focus of the show. It's just the reality of the time period.
But I think too, the fact that we had that ending monologue there was to reassure us that this is not etched in stone. This is what's going to happen. We still have a chance to change.
Yeah, that's right.
Get your act together so you can fix this. And I guess it wouldn't have bothered me so much that it was so in your face that way if we hadn't had other stories like Rosa that were in our face about other social issues. Chibnall's era has been a little bit more in your face and overt, I think, in places when talking about the social issues. Although at least they've been willing to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think again with like Rosa, it's like, yeah, have we solved this problem in the last 50 years? I don't think so. So maybe it is time for some in-your-face stuff. Like the subtle stuff isn't working. So, yeah.
Demons of Punjab. We have not solved the problem yet.
And the mental health episode this season.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I mean, they were definitely, you know, hammering the mental health issues home there. So.
Yeah, well, I think it's also good to remember, though, that we are not the only audience, right? There's also, you know, kids watching for whom, you know, this may be the first time they've encountered this issue and stuff like that. And, you know, like, you know, we old folks are pretty set in our ways and, you know, you're probably not going to change our minds that much. But, you know, like children or teenagers and so on are very malleable. And popular
when you're
entertainment can really make a difference.
Yeah, and when you're speaking to children of a certain age, you need to be a little bit more
That's right.
obvious about it so that they are able to process the information. There's a difference in the way an 8-year-old approaches these discussions than a 28-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're getting close to time. Panelists, do you want to mention anything particular you're working on? Do you want to direct people to things in the Artist Alley or Vendor's Room, or?
So, I mean, I guess you can check out ATB Publishing. that's the one in the Discord that I'm most associated with. Yeah, things I'm working on. I have various books that are always on the go. Have Outside In's coming out. Also just wrote a book on Millennium, which was a 90s TV show for Obverse as their Silver Archive, which is kind of a spin-off of the Doctor Who Black Archives kind of thing. So that's talking about lots of big world-shaking issues like this, not climate change per se, but many other things from really concerns from the 90s.
Michael?
I will just probably pimp my scale model solar system that I have at the Hennepin County Library System. I'm hoping to get it back out to a few libraries this summer. It is a scale model solar system on lawn signs. And so even with our pandemic restrictions at the libraries, it's something I can set up outdoors. So watch the Hennepin County social media if you want to visit it. Also, I was in lockdown working on something I didn't quite finish that I'm hoping to finish this year. And I'm hoping that the higher ups in the library system will go for it. But I was working on a virtual version of the scale model solar system that could be inserted into Google Earth very easily. Like it would just basically be a file you could download and insert into your copy of Google Earth or even Google Earth in the web browser, and you would overlay a scale model of the solar system and some other details. And I'm hoping I can get back and finish that at some point. So I do work some science education into my job as a librarian now. So,
and I want to point out ATB Publishing in both Discord and the Vendor's Room, because I've got books that Stacey has had me write essays for from them, and I also have a Artist Alley, whatever you want to call it, and in Discord about my books. So
you want to add one more thing to Pimp? Jesse reminded me in the chat, Greater Midwest Lego Train Club is at the Twin City Model Railroad Museum in St. Paul. If you want to see model trains in various scales, including a big Lego train layout, come and see us. Museums have really hurt this year in the pandemic. The museum's open 1 day a week right now. Anything you can do to support us would be great.
Okay. And if you're currently watching this, please like this video and subscribe to our page. Council Room is happening virtually January 15th through January 17th. We're close to ending ceremonies. Find out all the things that are happening by visiting our webpage. And it's not scrolling fast enough here. Found at www.council-room.com. And
buy a t-shirt.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sales are going on through Saturday.
Today's Sunday. So you're talking next Saturday?
Next Saturday, yep.
Okay. So any last words, panelists? Otherwise.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions in the chat. Thanks to the other panelists.
Yep. I would say I think 2020 is probably not an anomaly year. We're going to be in this kind of stuff for a long time, and climate change is a big driver of a lot of the things that we've seen. So this is something we need to pay attention to.
Yep.
And thank you, panelists, and thank you for those who are watching this video on YouTube or in Facebook, and thank you again.